Okay, good morning. Uh, We're going to deal with UI this morning again. Uh, I think I promised the committee, and I think it'd be very worthwhile to get a tutorial on um, chargeability, the timing of everything, dealing with our one, I think, major issue that we're dealing in the Sunset Bill S10. So I've asked Cameron Wood to give us a presentation. It's complicated, but it's not in some ways. But I think it'd be very useful for committee members, and I could use a refresher myself in terms of how a business gets charged, when, and when and the amount, and what earnings and uh, loss of employment impacts those rates. So, Cameron, are you ready to educate us?
Yes, sir.
Okay, go for it.
All right. Good morning. For the record, Cameron Wood, Unemployment Insurance Director, Vermont Department of Labor. Always happy to be here. I asked our LMI director, Matt Barowitz, to be available if he could be. Sometimes the conversation kind of strays a little bit into the LMI world, and we kind of collaborate with LMI in setting the tax rates. So I always rely on Matt to keep me honest.
LMI.
LMI.
What's LMI?
LMI is our labor market information. Yes, for those for those in the public or those who may not know, Matt is the chief of our labor market information division, and selfishly for me, helps our division, set UI tax rates and deals with everything kind of UI data related. But I'm selling Matt short. He does a lot more than that.
Before we get started, I just have to make one observation of our pro tem. I don't know how you're at 98 pounds if you're always eating.
Mr. Chair, you have to understand, I have a very high metabolism. I'm kind of like a squirrel. I'm a squirrel. I'm constantly in motion.
Yes,
so
I see that. Okay.
We experienced this.
Yes.
We're missing sharing that with you, actually.
But I apologize.
No need to apologize. It's very nice.
We're so glad you're anchoring our room. I feel like we're almost all there, with at least one of us being there.
Okay, Kevin.
Right. Yeah, so the chair asked me to come in and kind of do a 101 on chargeability and how experience ratings are set and how that impacts an employer's tax rating. So I kind of, wrote down some notes for myself. I didn't come in with, a PowerPoint or anything. At some point, I will try to share my screen and pull up some information from our website that I think could be helpful and at least a visual of the different tax schedules and how we go about calculating someone's benefit ratio. But I'll start with just kind of the basics. The U.S. Department of Labor requires UI programs to maintain an individualized employer account for each liable employer in the different states. The reasoning behind this is because, it is intended to operate in some sense as an insurance system. So employers who have a high turnover, their employees are taking advantage of the system more frequently. The thought process behind this is they should be then paying back into the fund at a higher rate in order to help offset the benefits that are coming out. An employer that has a much more, stable employment situation and doesn't have as much turnover, doesn't lay off individuals as frequently. The theory behind this is they then should benefit from that, and they should not be negatively impacted, by circumstances in the fund. So we're required to maintain individualized employer accounts in order to to have a system whereby individual employers who are utilizing the system more frequently, I don't want to say taking advantage, utilizing the system more frequently, are impacted in the fact that they then have to pay more into the fund. So that's why for every employer we maintain I think we're upwards pre-pandemic. I know we were over 24,000 individual employer accounts that were being maintained here at the Department of Labor for every employer that is liable to either pay into the UI trust fund or liable to reimburse the trust fund for charges. And that's where you get there's a presumption of chargeability or a presumption of charges. We don't relieve charges at the outset of an individual's claim. And what that means is for employers that have wages in someone's base period, and I was hoping to be succinct and somewhat not go too much down rabbit holes, so I'm happy to kind of go down and talk about base periods if the committee wants, but essentially the base period is the period in which we look at your wages to determine whether you are monetarily eligible for unemployment. There is a minimum level of monetary wages that you have to have received in order to be eligible for UI. And so when someone files for their benefits and we determine they're eligible, we will charge the employers that are in their base period. And like I said, because of the system that we have, there's kind of a presumption that if you have wages in the base period, you will be proportionally charged for those wages. So, if 75% of my wages are made up by my employment with, Senator Sorokin, the chair, and 25% of my wages are made up from employment with Senator Clarkson, the chair would be charged 75% of my benefits. Senator Clarkson will be charged 25% of my benefits.
Just briefly, and in every example here, I hope you'll focus on the typical case and not get into, like, for instance, in that one, most employees and employers are just going to have one employer.
Correct.
So, when is the base period? Is it, it's a look back period? And, I don't want to go through the 3 or 4 different alternatives.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
But the main one.
The standard base period we look at is the first 4 of your last 5 completed calendar quarters. And this is actually one of the things we have had a little bit of struggle, getting employers to understand is if you were to come in the door and file for benefits during the first quarter of 2021, so right now, we go all the way back to the 4th quarter of 2019 to pick up wages to determine whether or not you're eligible. And so the typical case, sticking to what the chair is asking here, is going to be somebody who meets that the first method, and it's the first 4 of the last 5. So as we move quarters forward, the base period just rolls forward with it. When we go to quarter 2 of 2021, the base period would become the calendar year 2020. And so
please feel free to ask questions as you go if you don't get that. But so the example is a good one. It's once you determine the base period, what months or what 12-month period is your base period, then you look at to see if you have enough earnings during that base period, which are relatively minimal, to qualify for unemployment. And if you qualify, then those are presumptively charged to the employer you work in a calculation I assume we'll get to.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage by saying, you have individual employer accounts, and because of the system that we have, there is a presumption of charges. Now, as we talked very briefly, and before I get into kind of how we calculate your experience rating, I will pause to say there's the presumption of charges, but then there are circumstances in which we will relieve employers of charges. And so if an individual has voluntarily quit a job, they can still use those wages to make themselves monetarily eligible, but we will not charge any employer where somebody has voluntarily quit, either in this benefit year or a future benefit year. If an individual is laid off because of misconduct, we will relieve the employer of charges in the instance where the individual separated because of misconduct. The individual can still be eligible to receive unemployment after disqualification period, but we relieve employers, because if you've, the theory here, if you've let someone go because they've done some misconduct here, then you shouldn't be obligated to be charged for those benefits.
Just let me interrupt you, just because I'm wearing two hats here, understanding the system and trying to put myself in a situation of some of my committee members. The important point here is that a lot of those people that Cameron just explained, they may have enough wages in that base period, but there are other qualifying factors to get the benefits themselves, so that they may not qualify for benefits. Frequently, they won't. If you voluntarily leave for a personal reason, you don't get benefits. If you're laid off for misconduct, you don't get benefits. But there are exceptions to those where they will get benefits, and even then the employer will not get charged, because it's not the fault of the employer that the job has been lost. So
exactly. Senator Ram.
I'm just going to sound like a broken record forever, but even those, I think it would be very interesting at some point to know gender and racial breakdown of who's, being terminated for misconduct, et cetera. I think there's probably some really valuable information in there.
Okay. I'm making a note for myself here. So yes, I think, Mr. Chair, you're doing a great job kind of supplementing, helping flesh this out with me. Exactly. There are exceptions to all these circumstances. And so the concept here is that we do not charge employers where, they are not at fault for the separation. And so going back to, what does this mean for an individual employer, and how does this actually impact the tax rate that we set? The charges that are attributed, and I guess let me take, no, I'll hold that thought for a second. The charges that we're attributing to an employer's account are accumulated over the calendar year. And we use the charges to calculate their benefit ratio, which helps determine what their tax rate is going to be. And so there are mainly two types of systems throughout the country. There's benefit ratio states, and then there's what's called reserve ratio states. Vermont is a benefit ratio state. And the primary difference here, there's a lot of subtle nuance, but the primary difference here is that the state of Vermont will only look at a 3-year look back period. There are some states that look back for the entirety of an employer's existence to help calculate their tax rate, to help come up with a ratio. For the state of Vermont, we only do a 3-year calendar look back. And so as we're going to set the tax rates this July, we will look at calendar years 2018, 2019, and 2020. And so here's where I wanted to share something from our website. And
so while you're doing that, Mr. Chair, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So Cameron, what do we do about new businesses? I mean, that's all well and good for businesses that are stable and have been in business for a while. What do we do about new businesses?
So new businesses will receive, and let me know if everybody can see my screen at this point.
It's tiny.
Let's see. Is that helping at all?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So to the question, a new business will be given a new employer tax rate, which is set at 1% until they can establish an experience rating according to how we set the rates for other employers. So until a new employer has at least one full calendar year under their existence, if you will, they will receive 1% at a new employer rate, unless the employer is a successor to another employer. And we're going to go down a little rabbit hole there.
Let's
Oh,
not.
it's okay.
Let's
You don't
not
need to
go
go
there.
down that.
Okay. I'll hold on that for a second.
Let's
So-
play with the typical stuff. Okay.
Okay, so in order to set the rate, their tax rate, so as you can see here, we would, and this is from our website, you would look at, this is just an example for 2017, 2018, and 2019. And these would be the charges here on the middle column that have been attributed to the employer's account. And then what we would take is we would also look at the taxable wages that the employer paid out during the same period. And so then we would come up here at the bottom, as you can see, we would just take the benefits charged divided by the taxable payroll, and that would get their benefit ratio. And so that will help set their tax rate. And so then what we have to do is we have to actually move down into the tax array, which I'll come down here.
This is the infamous matrix I was.
Yes, sir. And so what we can see here, and I'll try to dive in and explain, just for the committee, this is set in statute. It is in section 1326. And so you can go find this in your green books or get Damien to grab a copy. Again, this is on our website. I did share it, with the committee, so you have it. So
Let me
again,
just interrupt just to
yes, sir.
emphasize. So very simply put, your benefit ratio will be the amount of benefits your employees have taken out of the system over the 3-year period for that are chargeable to you because you laid them off is the main reason, and it will be compared to the overall wages you paid out, or the chart is it just the wages that you paid out up to $14,000 per employee?
Yes, sir. We just look at the taxable wages.
That's up to 14,000 right now, right? Something like that.
14,100. Yes, sir.
So they could take all the wages for each individual employee up to 14,000 over the last year, and you compare it to the amount of charged benefits that your employees have taken out of the system. So in a lot of cases, they'll have taken out nothing. And you have to do the math there, I guess, and you get the lowest experience rating in that case.
Yes, sir. And so what we do then, because we have to set this, the tax schedule, and we have to set the tax rates every July. And so what that means is we have to set the tax schedule. And as you can see here at the top, we have 5 different tax schedules, 1 being the lowest, all the way up to 5 being the highest. And as you can see, when you go down through the array, in each step of the array, the taxes, increase as we move up in the tax schedules. So I'll talk a little bit about how we set the tax schedule here in a minute. I'm going to hold off on that for just a second. For now, know that we are in tax schedule 1, which is the lowest tax schedule. So as we go to set the rates, we're going to take the employer's benefit ratio that we just talked about, but then we have to compare them to all other employers in the state of Vermont. And here's where I know it gets a little frustrating for employers. They always reach out to us. They say, hey, how do I know what my tax rate is going to be for next year? And we tell them that there are difficulties in determining that because A, we have to know what your ratio is, and we're not going to know that until the end of the calendar year. But then B, we have to compare you as it relates to all the other employers in the state of Vermont, okay? So for employers that have a 0 benefit ratio, they've had 0 charges attributed to their account, they will fall here in the lowest bracket, the 0. And Matt, feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the majority of employers, just from a numbers perspective, live in this category, live in the 0 category because they don't have charges against them. The other employers that have a benefit ratio are then sorted among the remaining 20 classes. And so I'm just showing you this goes all the way down to 20. So all the way up to 5.4% in tax rate schedule 1, up to 8.4% in tax rate schedule 5. So we have to bucket the employers in all evenly in wages. We have to bucket them in all 20 of these arrays based on their benefit ratio. And that's how we set their individual tax rate. So if you're an employer and your benefit ratio is just X, and then we compare you relative to the other employers in the state of Vermont, you will fall somewhere among this 20 classes. And that's what will set your tax rate for the following July to June period. So if you fall on 13, you're going to pay 3.2% of the taxable wage base. As the chair said, right now it's the first $14,100 you pay in wages to your employees. You're going to pay that tax rate, and that rate will begin effective in July of each year, whatever the rate that you are set at is. There are a few caveats to that, and then Senator Ron, I see your question or your hand up. We cannot treat employers with the same benefit ratio differently. So if an employer has the same benefit ratio, but when we do the array, one of them lands in step 14, one of them lands in step 13, we have to move the one from 14 up into 13. Because if you have the same benefit ratio, you can't be at a higher tax rate than another employer with the same benefit ratio. Hope that makes sense. And Senator Rahm, to your question.
So I feel like maybe if I say this out loud, it will help me understand this better. So if you have a spike in your rate because of the pandemic, that will follow you for 3 years because it will be part of the 3-year average.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we're seeing the start of it this year, but it will continue to affect people for 3 years.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there anything of note in the Great Recession about, how this effect lingered that is worth sort of understanding? Did it diminish quickly?
I have a thought to that I would add, and then I would actually kind of defer to Matt if he knows anything kind of related to the Great Recession or impacts. What I can say is, especially for small employers, the impact can be pretty substantial. Even in the past few years, we've had conversations with employers who, I'm thinking of one employer in particular, had been in business for 25 years, had never laid anyone off, laid off one individual. The individual drew max benefits, so just meaning the individual exhausted their benefit year. All of those benefits were charged back to that employer. And it had a pretty negative impact on the employer because he didn't have that much in taxable wages. He didn't have a large business. And so the ratio really hurt him. He ended up paying back into the fund. I'm wanting to say it was 2 to 3 times more than the benefits that came out of the fund. And I remember that employer being pretty negatively impacted by that. But Matt, I don't know if there's anything from the recession you want to add there. And then I see our commissioner has raised his hand if he wants to jump in.
Good morning, everyone. For the record, I'm Matthew Bearwitz, Director of the Economic and Labor Market Information Division. Yes, that's what I was going to echo is what can happen for small employers, which Director Wood just mentioned, but also what I think we find is a lot of inquiries maybe a year or 2 later because they might not have had a layoff in a year or 2. They're thinking that their experience rating should be much better, but what happens is relative to everyone else, their improvements were not as great. And as a result, they might have stayed in a higher rate class than they initially suspected they would because they might have had a clean record for 2 years. But as you mentioned, Senator Rahm, with a 3-year look back, and then in comparison to how everyone else did, it can impact, it can be a surprise for employers of where they come out in the tax rate class.
So let me just interrupt quickly, Matt or Cameron. Can you just continue to, in terms of framing the issue, why this complexity is here and why this experience rating is here and why the 1 through 5, which you'll get to, is there. Just in 30 seconds, explain the overarching principle of the solvency of the trust fund and why we have to keep adjusting these rates to make sure there's enough money there that we don't go into the red.
Very quickly, and Matt, please supplement here. I mean, when you look at what tax rate we're in, whether it's 1 through 5, that takes into consideration a different calculation. We look at how much in benefits were paid out. What was the worst year of benefit payouts that we've had over the past 10 years? It's a 10-year look back versus how much money's in the trust fund currently. And we're trying to, the calculation, if you will, is trying to determine, how much taxes do we need to bring in the next year to maintain some sort of adequacy moving forward. And so, that's where that will determine what tax rate schedule we need to be in. So when you look at over the past 5 years, we've seen that as the trust fund has continued to grow. I remember when I took my position, we were in tax schedule 5. We had been in tax schedule 5 since the recession when we had to borrow money. And so as we were able to build up our reserves, the calculation was determining that we had enough money, or we were beginning to have enough money, that we saw the tax rate schedule start to come down. We went down to, Matt, I believe we went down to 4, then 3, then finally we've come all the way back down to 1. And there are some corresponding adjustments that are made. For example, when we hit tax schedule 3, there was an automatic $2,000 reduction in the taxable wage base. And then same thing when we hit schedule 1, automatic $2,000 reduction in the taxable wage base. So the thought process is, the tax rate schedule will move and shift as necessary in order to build up reserves into the fund, taking into consideration how much is there now and what the look back has been. How much have you paid out in the past? Matt, what are your thoughts there?
I have really nothing to add. I think that was pretty clear.
Okay.
I would like to add that the use of the word automatic is could be misleading. Those things that are called automatic changes to tweak, to raise more money or lower money, are very much directly based upon policy that the legislature has enacted. So we want to say, okay, at a certain tax rate schedule, we can take our foot off the gas a little bit and not charge employers as much. Or as the trust fund gets healthy, we can afford to pay additional benefits that have been frozen for a while. So this is where our committee is going to be directly involved in understanding this chart, because how much are we willing to make a policy change when the fund is healthy, or how much do we need a tax increase and benefit cuts when the tax rate is when we're in trouble. And I guess one just last thing is, which sticks in my mind from the 2010 grand bargain, where we put a lot of new moving parts in place, is that if we were to have to borrow funds for a certain amount of time, there was a federal tax surcharge that was put on employers that we really want to avoid at all costs. That's why we heard in 2010, we got to address the solvency of this fund. And if we don't make statutory adjustments, it's sort of like what we're dealing with the pension issue right now. Are we going to cut people's benefits to keep that fund healthy? In this case, there's a big hammer looming over us if we cut back on the solvency of the fund by too much. I don't know if the commissioner wants to say something. I know he's a big supporter of the solvency of the fund, and that's his job. So to make sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll keep it brief. For the record, Michael Harrington, Commissioner, Department of Labor. I was actually, and you took the words right out of my mouth, Mr. Chair, wanted to mention that there were a lot of things that we were contemplating doing prior to COVID-19, and Cameron hit on those about, given the fact that our trust fund was so healthy, the most solvent in the country, if you will. We were looking at ways to provide additional relief to employers, and looking at a variety of different methods to do that. It's a lot easier to do that when the sun is shining than when the rain is falling, if you will. So, I think we would still love to look at, there's a balance between, providing relief during negative times to help employers stay in business and keep people employed, to minimize the draw on the trust fund. At the same time, recognizing that because of such a hit that our trust fund has taken, also needing to make sure we're cognizant of needing to focus on replenishing the fund for no other reason than the faster we replenish the fund just through the statute alone, the ability we will have to reduce the rate and the burden on employers. So the longer it takes to replenish the fund, the longer the burden is on employers just through the tax schedule alone. And the faster we can replenish the fund, the quicker we can come down in the tax schedules to get to a more positive tax posture.
Can you or Cameron just briefly, I'm violating my own rule, but could you briefly talk about the FUTA tax and what the implication of that is? I mean, especially when compared to this matrix here.
Sure, I will go back to eating my popcorn over here and watching Cameron regale you on all things UI.
Okay.
And remember, FUTA, we need an acronym.
Yes, ma'am. So thank you, Mr. Chair. There were a few other notes I wanted to hit. You had mentioned FUTA, and I wanted to bring it up too because you had commented on it. I think it's important. Senator Clarkson, FUTA is the federal Unemployment Tax Act. That is
right.
what the acronym stands for. But essentially, what the chair is referring to, and what is important to keep in mind, is employers pay federal unemployment tax as well as state unemployment tax. The federal unemployment tax for all employers is set at 6% of the first $7,000 an employer pays. That the taxable wage base is essentially $7,000, and the percentage is essentially 6%. There is no array like this in the Federal Tax Act. However, employers who are in compliance with, essentially, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but employers who are in compliance with their state unemployment tax requirements will get a reduction in their federal tax burden, if you will. They get a 5.4% reduction in their federal unemployment taxes. So their rate goes from 6% down to 0.6% on those $7,000. However, if the state has to borrow money, then the state, if they don't pay it back within a certain period of time, the FUTA tax credit that employers receive begins to reduce. So instead of getting a 5.4% reduction, I can't remember off the top of my head how quickly it goes down, but it would go down to 5.2 or 5% over the years, the longer the state takes to pay off the trust fund. So we all acknowledge that borrowing is a situation we never want to be in, because when we borrow, the interest has to be paid on the money that we borrow, and the interest cannot come from the UI contributions that are collected. And then the longer the state goes without paying that loan off, the impact it has on employers by the reduction in the federal tax credit that they receive. So that is important to note. A few other quick details I just wanted to comment on. I appreciate the chair's comment there about when I was referring to automatic, that is absolutely correct. This was a policy decision that was made back in 2010 that was put into place by the legislature to allow for those reductions. So that is set in policy and can be changed by the committee. And then a few other just quick notes I wanted to make. One, I wanted to comment that the dates, Mr. Chair, you had asked for the dates here. So unfortunately, there's as the impacts to employers, the things that impact the taxes are set at two different times. So the taxable wage base, the 14,100, that's what employers pay, whatever rate they're on here, 0.4%, 1.7% on schedule on rate 8 here, whatever rate they pay on, it's that taxable wage base. The taxable wage base is set in January, and it's a calendar year. So every January that is set at whatever it is for the coming calendar year. And however, the tax rate schedule and the employer's tax rate, their experience rating, where the employer falls on this array 1 through 20, and whether we're in tax schedule 1 through 5, that is set in July of every year. And so I think that's just an important distinction when we look at what tax rate schedule we're going to be in, and when we look at what experience rating an employer is going to have, that is set in July. And so a few more minor comments I'll make, Mr. Chair, if you'll indulge me for a second. When we have to set it in July, that's where we at the department have to work backwards. And that's why we're in a little bit of an urgency here. Not only for this conversation, but if there's going to be anything done with the tax schedule, the wage base, we have to set that in July, and we have to pull that back. We have to give employers notice within a reasonable time. And so then in order to do the work, all the work we talked about, in order to create the benefit ratios for each employer, in order to lay the employers out in the array, and then in order to set the employers within the array, we really have to start that work kind of late March, really at the latest kind of beginning of April, in order to do all the work necessary to get the tax rates set, get them programmed into our system, get the notice out to employers. It's one of the things that we really do as much work up front and as much testing and review afterwards, so we know that it's accurate, because it has that drastic of an impact on employers. The last comment I'll make here, and then I'll back to you, Mr. Chair, for anything you want me to fill in. I just want to comment that even if we do relieve charges for all employers in calendar year 2020, for example, that does not mean that all the employers will move up this array because they don't have charges, because the statute actually requires that when you go from 1 down to 20, we have to put an equal number of overall wages. This may get a little complicated, and I apologize, but I think it's important to notice for one reason. We have to put an equal number of wages in each of these buckets. And why I'm bringing that up is to say that even if we relieve charges, there will be employers in this bottom rank here. There will be employers in this one. And so it can have a slight impact on the amount of money that we bring in, but it's not going to have a large impact of the amount of money that the trust fund brings in. Matt kind of refers to it this way. The trust fund's going to bring in what the trust fund needs. And because we're going to have employers down here in this bottom bucket, we're going to have employers down here in section 19, even if some of them have been relieved of charges, because the statute requires us to spread them out into this array in a specific way. So I just wanted to highlight that last piece, Mr. Chair. I hope I didn't go down a rabbit hole you didn't want to go down, but I just thought that was important.
It's actually something I was unaware of. And you say you're required to do that by statute?
Yes, sir. When you look at this, this picture here is missing one column, and I can bring it up. If you look at the section 1326, or if you look at if you look at it on the website, unfortunately, when you look at the statutory section on the legislature's website, the graph gets messed up a little bit. It's not very visually useful, unfortunately. So there is a requirement that there are it's essentially 5% of the taxable payrolls across the entire state have to be in each of these buckets. Now, what that means is we have to take all the employers, again, going back to what we talked about a little bit ago, we take their benefit ratio, we have to lay them all out in a line and see where they all rank by benefit ratio. And then we have to cut them up into buckets to essentially put 5% of the taxable wages in this bucket, 5% of the taxable wages in that bucket, 5% in that bucket. So, depending on, that's where we always tell people, depending on where you as an employer fit on that array will really dictate what tax, what ranking you fall here. And so we are obligated to kind of essentially spread out employers among the array, regardless of whether they've been relieved of charges. In those instances, it will impact some employers differently than others, but we will have to spread them out along the array. Matt, you came off mute.
I was just going to connect the dots to Senator Rahm's point earlier about our experiences during the Great Recession and how even if we relieve charges for a particular employer due to COVID layoffs, it's possible that they had a benefit experience rating above 0 in the prior years. That would put them somewhere in these, upper tax brackets just because of how they compare against everyone else.
Again, that's a statutory requirement.
Yes, sir.
I'm not suggesting we in any way change that, but we could, and it's also it's designed that way. Why, Matt? To protect the health of the fund somehow?
I don't know the legacy of why that is. It's just how we're considered an array state, and this is how the distribution of the array works, where the taxable wages are distributed across the 20 rate classes for all people with experience ratings over 0. I assume it is to assign tax rates to those based on experience and trying to keep it consistent throughout.
So if we're going back to our piece of legislation, Cameron, if we are, and this has a timing issue, if we're going to relieve charges, I mean, take the easy one at this point. Let's assume, it's somebody who drew benefits who wouldn't have otherwise been eligible to draw benefits if we hadn't liberalized the criteria for voluntary quits. We are going to first be looking at individual employer who has an employee like that after we have finished the calendar year of 2020. So we're going to look back at all the benefits drawn during that period for that individual employee and employer through calendar year 2020. Some of those charges will be for COVID related. Some might not be, but for the most part, it's going to be COVID related. And we're going to do some calculation starting now for that year for 2020. Starting in January, you're starting to look at the benefit calculations for those people, those circumstances. And then the impact of that calculation will first hit that employer on July 1st of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And it will be on the first 14,000 of wages paid starting July 2021. So you get most of your receipts, October 15th of any given year?
No, sir. So we actually, real quick, and I'll just acknowledge for you, Mr. Chair, Damian raised his hand, but real quick, what we're doing right now, everything you said there at the beginning, yes, sir. What we are having to do now is, as we're getting ready to set the tax rates for this coming July to June, we are now looking back because remember, when we do the benefit ratio, this is for the committee, when we do the benefit ratio, we're looking at calendar years. So now that 2020 is over, 2020 will impact their tax rate that is set in July of 2021. And so we're looking at it by saying we need to resolve any outstanding benefit charge relief issues now, because we need to get this done so we can then create their benefit ratio to then create their tax rate. So throughout calendar year 2020, we were relieving employers when it was standard practice, if there were voluntary quits, etc. Now we're trying to tackle the instances where there are the relief that was passed in Act 91, and we're trying to resolve this, obviously, with the committees, the committee being involved here and having the discussion with you all. So when we set the tax rate in July, they would pay on the taxable wage base for the calendar year. So if the employer has already hit the taxable wage base for a given individual, they would not owe any more taxes on that individual for the remainder of the year. So our biggest receipts actually come in during the first quarter, because that's when most employers are paying on the taxable wage base, because the taxable wage base is by calendar year as well. So most our receipts come in the first quarter. If they hire a new individual, or they haven't hit the taxable wage base yet by July 1st, they would then pay anything above what they've already paid, or for new employees, they would begin to pay the taxable wage base on whatever their new rate is established. And that rate will last them all the way through June of next year. So it will really have an impact. In theory, it would really have a major impact in the first quarter of next year. If somebody went from 0, all the way up to 10 or all the way up to 20, if they've already paid the taxable wage base on all their employees, it's going to hit them in the first quarter of next year when they have to start paying on the taxable wage base again.
Okay, so I understand that. It's pretty complicated. I guess one nuance on that, when they pay let's say most of them are paying for the wages in the first quarter.
Mm-hmm.
Do they pay weekly or bi-weekly during the first quarter, or do they wait until the quarter is over to assess what they owe for that entire quarter?
We collect once a quarter. So they're due, the statute says they are due at the end of the month following the close of the calendar quarter. So for the first quarter, they would be due by April 30th. We have a window in which we allow them to file. It usually starts towards the beginning of the month or the end of March, but they would have to be due by April 30th.
Okay. Damien, did you have your hand up?
I did. I just wanted to make one sort of side comment and clarification. While we do have some leeway to, if we wanted to affect how the tax brackets are set up, we are required by federal law to experience rate employers and to charge them based on their benefit experience. So we can't give everyone a flat rate. So I just wanted to make clear that we don't have the leeway to somehow do a flat tax or something like that to try to hold some employers harmless. We have to have these experience rated buckets. There are, as Cameron's mentioned, various ways to do that. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have some employers who pay a higher tax rate than others because based on their experience and layoffs that cannot be non-charged.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
So the committee can see how complicated this is, and we tried to keep it as simple as possible. I want to just bring us down to the real world for a second. Let's assume you have a business that has 20 employees at $50,000 of taxable wages, no, $50,000 of wages each. So they have $1 million payroll. Can you put them in the upper left-hand corner and put somebody in the lower right-hand corner and tell us how much taxes that business, those two businesses are going to pay, the difference?
I did, we pulled some information together, and I'm gonna share the screen again just so the committee has it so we can look at it. We did share a little bit of information in September of last year, and I can see what I can pull together and shoot it off to the committee in an email, Mr. Chair. But I mean, essentially, it's somebody here is going to pay 0.4% on, you know, whatever their taxable wage, so whatever their taxable wages are. So, you know, if that's $50,000, that's what they're going to pay on, versus somebody who's at the bottom of the array, it's up to 5.4%. When you get up to the top of the tax schedule, it would be 8.4% would be the highest someone could pay on.
So
whatever.
my example, I just want to let the committee see some real life examples. We're going to take 20 employees at the chargeable, the amount of the base period that's taxed is up to 14,000. Let's say each one of them has 14,000. So 20 times 14,000 is 280,000. In the upper left-hand corner, they'd be paying $280. And in the lower right-hand corner, they'd be paying how much per year? 8.4% times.
Give me 1 second. Matt, you're probably gonna be better at this than I am.
If I saw the chart correctly, where we're looking at a difference between a 0.4 tax rate and a 5.4% tax rate.
8.4 in the
Oh,
worst case.
8.4.
So it'd be 8.4 on 280,000, right?
Yes, sir.
Something like 25,000, 20.
I got 23,688 on that one.
Can I ask a question?
So I just want to let the committee know
Yeah.
that this is very important in terms of how it hits the employer, from $280 to $23,000.
So, Mr. Chair, what I had on the top, if you're at 0.4%, Matt, you do the math too, and correct me if I'm wrong here. It would be a little over $1,000 is what you'd pay into the fund versus somebody at 8.4% with the same number of employees paying on the same taxable wage base. They would pay $23,688 on the same number of employees. Now that's, you know, the lowest tax rate possible under tax schedule 1 versus the highest tax rate possible under a tax schedule 5. But that is the range of impact, Mr. Chair, that you're trying to get at.
Senator Rahm.
So what I lost track of is how that, for the employer experience, how that relates to their federal tax liability, and if they remain aligned or they don't have a federal tax liability. Is that what?
No, ma'am. It just their state where they fall on that array will not impact what they pay at the federal level. Everyone will pay the same at the federal level as long as they are in compliance with their state UI tax liabilities. Essentially, again, I'm simplifying this a little bit, but if they're in compliance with their state tax liability, they will get their FUTA credit reduction. Senator Clarkson, the FUTA is the Federal Unemployment Tax Act credit reduction, but every employer will pay the same rate at the federal level on their employees. They don't have the similar.
Will they have to increase that at the federal? Are we?
I don't think the feds have touched the Federal Unemployment Tax Act in decades.
Okay.
No, they don't, you know, as we move and shift with the needs of our UI trust fund, the federal rate just stays the same.
They're borrowing rather than trying to do
well,
benefit ratio.
The only thing that the federal UI taxes are used for are to pay for the administration of the unemployment program.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, UI programs are supposed to be federally funded. We are federally funded. An argument as to whether it's adequate or not, different conversation. But the federal UI taxes are in theory raised to pay for state administration of the program. They also use those monies to pay out the loans that are provided to states when states need to borrow because their trust fund is no longer solvent. There's also a few other purposes that they're able to use that money for. But at the end of the day, I think talking to macro federal fiscal policy here,
So Senator Rahm, just to put it in perspective very quickly, we really don't need to be worried very much about the food tax, other than we can't go into the red. The food tax is $42 per employee across the state of Vermont. It's cents of 1% times $7,000. That's what you pay, the employers pay on each employee right now. And we don't want that to change. So if we keep the fund solvent, it's sort of bug dust compared to the other stuff.
Yep.
But so a misunderstanding that I have had, I think, is when people get additional federal benefits added to their unemployment right now, that is coming from the general budget deficit, not from a fund that the federal government has to increase the value of unemployment benefits for people right now.
I would need to probably do some digging into, and I don't know. I don't want to circle back with Dirk and find out. The federal programs, what is being funded by the USDOL dollars, are coming from federal dollars, and they're being transferred to us, in theory, from the federal UI trust fund account. But I'm thinking more of just how it's being moved in our finance system in the USDOL world to us, as far as whether that's specifically coming from food taxes that are raised or whether that's being funded by some, general fund dollars at the federal level. I don't know, but I can say that those charges, like the FPUC, the additional $600, those do not get charged to Vermont employer to impact their food tax or to impact their state UI tax.
Okay.
Senator Clarkson, you're muted.
I won't say what I'm pulling. It's I'm trying to be good. As in the education fund, we try not to go below a certain percent. We try and keep a certain amount of reserves. What is the lowest amount we like to see in our UI trust fund? And what rate, when you say we go into the red, what rate, at what point do we start being concerned? And at what point, at what amount do we not want to go below? I guess that's what I'm asking.
So I'll,
what's our threshold for concern?
I will channel the chair here and say that, I think that is a conversation, right, that has to be set, between the department and the committees, as to what level of a UI trust fund is the state comfortable feeling like is absolutely necessary. I will give you my personal thought on this real quick. I mean, as long as we maintain $1 in the trust fund and we don't have to borrow, then we've been successful, if that makes sense. As long as we start going in the right direction again, okay? I think there is a certain reserve that we would like to see in the trust fund. And then it's just going to be a modeling of how much money do we feel is necessary. Do we feel that we need enough money to be able to withstand a standard recession type situation? Or moving forward, do we feel we need to maintain enough money to be able to withstand another pandemic like we've just experienced? The benefits that we've paid out over this past year vastly dwarf anything we paid out during the last recession. And so I think that's a conversation that we would have as far as what we feel a threshold needs to be. one thing we talked a little bit about last September was how much money do we feel we need to have on hand to make sure we're going to make it through the winter months, for example. The fourth quarter is where we bring in the least amount of money, and that is due in January. So our fourth quarter contribution date is actually coming up at the end of the week this week, beginning of next week. But it's also typically our busiest time of the year because we have all the seasonal layoffs. So how much do we need to have in order to ensure that we don't ever, need to borrow in that first quarter? I think is really where you want to drive, Senator Clarkson. And I know that the department is trying to finalize our projections that are due at the end of this week, beginning of next week to the committee. So I don't want to speak too soon, but I want to acknowledge that that's really where I would frame the conversation. And I think we'll have more information next week once we're able to finalize that report. I hope that helps.
Thanks.
Are there other questions? Cameron, is there more to the 101 that you want to follow up on or share with us?
No, sir. I think, as you've mentioned, and I really appreciate you helping facilitate there and supplement it because, it is extremely complicated, especially when you get into the details. I mean, there's a lot we haven't necessarily gone down, but I think we've hit the highlights. I don't have anything else I would add. I'd look to Matt just to make sure there wasn't anything that we didn't cover that you and I had talked about. But yeah, Mr. Chair, just if there's any questions or anything that pops up after we wrap up today, happy to follow up with anyone.
Okay. Matt, I don't know if you could help us at all by sending the committee or referring us to certain charts. I remember like from 2010, there were an amazing number of charts. If we did X, this is where it would go. This would be a drain on contributions, or this would be a drain on outgoing benefits. And I don't know if that, as an example, if there is something that maybe you could send out to the committee from historical things, just so people could, we're going to have to look at those things as we go forward, and while this is somewhat fresh in people's mind, they can get a better feel of what we're going to have to deal with. I hope this has been helpful. Cameron is right. You can get really nuanced here. For every rule, there are 5 exceptions that we talked about already that we have to look at. But what I'm trying to do, the administration, just to frame it again, if you look at that matrix, normally people are saying, based upon all the benefits that have gone out, chargeability or not, it's likely that very quickly the top chart will go from 1 to 5 in the next iteration of this, and that's going to hit employers hard. So the question our committee is going to have to answer is, if we let it go generically because of what we have in place for rules, is that hitting businesses too hard? And if we freeze it, I don't know if the administration is still going to come in with a proposal to freeze it at 1. What is that going to mean for the health of the trust fund? So we're going to be dealing with all of that, not necessarily in S10, but in a committee bill, probably. Senator Rahm.
So I guess my big question is, are there any other changes that you could ever make to sort of soften the blow? Like, could you make it a 5-year average? I'm just wondering, like, are the parameters that are in place now cemented in there, or are there other tweaks you can make that taper the impact, of what will, it sounds like, be a huge impact next year?
They're multiple changes. It's not in concrete. Okay. It's a statute.
Right.
You can make any changes to the statute you want. For instance, last year when we dealt with this in committee, the administration proposal was a gradual going up from 1 to 5. They were going to go 1 to 3 and then to 5. Now they're being a little bit more aggressive and they're saying we want it to stay at 1 next year as opposed to going to 3. So there's all kinds of variations you can deal with, and that's when we get into the numbers. And if we don't have a good understanding, that's why I wanted to do this today. We're going to be shooting from the hip or being more dependent upon the experts and what they tell us without fully understanding that there might be other choices. And my experience, as I've told the commissioner of the department, is from the grand bargain in 2010, all of these things will impact the trust fund and to help businesses, but there are also families and people on UI who also need help. And so if we're going to ease the pain for businesses, do we also look at easing the pain for unemployed workers? So yes, Senator Clarkson.
Thanks. Cameron, we're wanting to move on this bill, in fairly soon. You mentioned waiting for some data or something that you were going to get next week. And I'm concerned that we may need that for us to do our work. Remind me of what you were mentioning.
Off the top of my head, I'm thinking, Senator Clarkson, that may have been more in line with the concern about gathering more data, gathering gender information, race and ethnicity information. I'm trying to think.
No, it wasn't that.
Yeah, Cam and Rue is referring to the fact that statutorily, the Vermont Department of Labor is required to provide an unemployment insurance trust fund report by January 31st to the committees of jurisdiction. So that report right now is being in final editing, basically, and production. So we understand that this information is very important to the committees and are trying to get it as complete and finalized as quickly as possible. As I said, the statutory requirement is January 31st, but as a result of the tremendous workload that the Vermont Department of Labor has undergone in the last year, we're finding complete 2020 data to be very difficult to come by right now, as things have, the focus and priority has been paying benefits and working with Vermonters who've been dislocated because of COVID. So we are working on estimates and things like this. And so we will have that report to you as soon as possible.
So may I follow up? I appreciate that. And we are all the beneficiaries of your hard work and our work together. Thank you again on behalf of so many of our constituents for whom you've intervened. We appreciate it. Goes on to this morning. It's constant. Is there anything we would need to know this week? I mean, you have already know the big takeaways. Is there anything we need to know this week for us to be working on the policy we're working on this week?
I'll let Cam jump in, but I would put together two questions that I've heard today, one from you, Senator Clarkson, and one from Senator Rahm, regarding what do you feel is an adequate level for the trust fund? You'll hear me use the word adequate. Historically, what we've talked about as a department is that it's if we're in Schedule 3, that means it's considered to be a situation that's stable. We can increase the tax rate to 4 or 5 if needed, if situations dictate it, or it could drop to 2 or 1 if the trust fund is taking in too much money relative to the benefits paying out. However, as Senator Rahm indicated in her question about, well, can we change it to a 20-year look back, or can we figure out how the rate schedules 1 through 5 are set? There's going to be that conversation because, as Cam talked about, the way that the tax rate schedule is determined is you take the worst year in the last 10 years. Well, for the next 10 years, let's pray that 2020 is the worst year for the next 10 years, right? But this worst year was twice as worse as the worst year of the last recession. So we're talking about a base payout of potentially, and again, data is still being finalized, around $390 million in benefits paid out that was hit to our UI trust fund. And if you're using a $390 million worst year case scenario, that is going to impact how much the trust fund thinks it needs. So to get back to a Schedule 1, just theoretically, and this is kind of a preview, a little teaser about what's going to be in the report, and I'm not speaking out of turn, Commissioner, but to get back to where we are now at Schedule 1, as the chair pointed out, we're most likely jumping to Schedule 5 next year unless intervention is taken. We'll need $1 billion in the fund to get back to Schedule 1. So that is a big number. When we were sitting around here 2 years ago talking about a trust fund with $300 million, $400 million, $500 million, and everyone's saying, I think there's too much money in the trust fund. Maybe we should look at some possible changes. Well, to get back to Schedule 1, based on the worst year we had in 2020, it's going to be about $1 billion. And maybe someone's going to say, you know what, maybe we're willing to take a chance that COVID-19 isn't going to be happening again, or a global pandemic. But that's, again, the public policy discussion, and I'll turn it to others now.
Thank you.
Commissioner, unless you want to jump in, I saw you come off camera. I mean, I agree with Matt. I think just moving forward, I think this will be a continuous conversation, not just this year, because of what Matt just identified. The impacts of this year are going to be felt in the calculations. But Senator Clarkson, to your point, I don't know that there's anything you need to know today that would be or would be detrimental if you didn't know it until Monday. I mean, this is really a policy conversation about, the department really thinks it important to recognize that, COVID-19 wasn't anyone's fault. And both from kind of an administrative and from that perspective and our administrative perspective, as if we're just focusing on S10, we'd like to be able to provide that benefit charge relief, because we don't feel that providing that charge relief is going to have really a negative impact on the trust fund. As we said, we will array individuals all the way through that highest tax bracket in Schedule 1. Regardless of whether we do charge relief. And so I really think some of the conversation as far as what is the adequacy of a fund, how much do we need in it, what's the number we don't want to go below, I really think that conversation, and I think, the chair is trying to set that conversation up, give everybody the information you need as we talk about what tax schedule do we need to be at, what taxable wage base do we need to be at. Those, I think, are really what's going to impact how much money is coming into the fund. And that's where I think, I don't know, we're having that conversation just yet. As Matt said, we're trying to finalize that trust fund report, and hopefully that will provide a lot of information.
I think and thanks, Cameron. In terms of S10, we did provide a memo to the committee assistant and the chair yesterday. In terms of our position, just wanted you to have it in writing so you could refer back to it. So that's the only immediate timing piece. I think the second component there is, and the reason that is time sensitive is because of the process for setting the rates for employers.
It's on our website for everybody else.
Great, thank you. So as Cameron has mentioned, that's the real timely piece. Because we will need to begin that rate setting process towards March, end of March and into April. And then the other policy pieces, the freezing of the taxable wage base proposal that we have and the freezing of the tax schedule that we have can come at a later date because, they are somewhat further down the road. Although I think, Cameron, do we need either of those potentially? I would assume to know where we're setting the rate for the July 21 year, correct?
Yes, sir. I mean, the S10 is really what, as the commissioner just said, is if for us as a department, if you're putting them on a priority order, S10 would have to come first, because I think the chair has mentioned that has a sunset date of March 31st. And we need to do the benefit charge relief within the coming 8 weeks at max in order to set the rates for the tax schedule this coming year. If we're going to have any type of freeze on the tax schedule or in a limiting of the tax schedule increase, that also is a priority, but that would need to be passed, by early April in order for us to be able to do the legwork to get it done in time. So I think S10, it would be the number one thing to tackle because it has a shorter sunset date. But then we would need to move into a tax schedule conversation. But we still have a little bit of a time, and we have the trust fund report coming out.
And I don't know if it has happened or not yet, but I know Cameron either has or is planning to connect with Damien to talk about what that language would look like for our proposal on the freezing of the schedule and the taxable wage base.
So we're going to wrap up very quickly. I was interested in Senator Clarkson's question. I think I heard that this last quarter, the information you get in end of January, in addition to the report, because it's the highest month, I guess, for unemployment, I think it may have some nuggets in there. So for waiting a couple of more days, I would like to see what the report says and see what the last quarter shows in terms of unemployment. But so I had it down for a possible vote on Friday. We'll probably push that to next week to have the benefit of that more information. But next week will be our deadline for getting this bill off to the floor. I really appreciate everybody's time. Incredibly dense stuff, but I hope it's a little bit useful when we get into these policy issues going forward. So we'll sign off, see a few of you in finance, or at least Senator Brock. Oh no, we're not going to finance. Are we meeting in finance after? Yes, we are. After the
budget address at Senate Democratic
At
Caucus
1.
at 12:15.
12:15.
Budget at 1, and all our afternoon committees right afterwards.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Have a good lunch.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.